Sure, I'll start. So hope everyone can hear me. Welcome to the Queen's University AI and Radiology Lecture Series. This is a collaboration between the Department of Diagnostic Radiology here at Queen's and the School of Computing. We've had a very successful last AI and lecture series back in April, so we're back for another round. A truly global event. The last time we had participants from 16 countries throughout the world. And so it'd be interesting to see who we have and from where this time around. So as registrants, if you have questions or comments you would like to ask, you could do that in the Q&A box. And if you do that, if you want to enter, type in which country you're from, that will be interesting to know. So before we introduce our speakers, and we have two wonderful speakers here, and in the theme of global, one of our speakers is from the United Kingdom, and we have another speaker from Brazil. But before we introduce them, I'd like to welcome our esteemed panelists back, and they're back and raring to go. So let me introduce our three panelists. So first of all, we have Dr. Amber Simpson from Queen's University. So Amber is the Canada Research Chair in Biomedical Computing and Informatics and Associate Professor here at Queen's University School of Computing, and with the cross appointment to the Department of Biomedical and Molecular Sciences. So she's an American Association of Cancer Research Award winner and the holder of multiple National Institutes of Health grants. So welcome, Amber, glad you're back. We also have Dr. Errol Kolak. Errol is a radiologist at St. Michael's Hospital, University of Toronto. He is the lead of the Diagnostic Imaging and Learning Algorithms, so that's DILA.ai team of the Li Ka-shing Center for Healthcare Analytics, Research and Training at St. Mike's Hospital. Errol was awarded the Odette Professorship in 2019 in Medical Imaging Data Science and Analytics. Welcome, Errol. And last but not least, we have Dr. Anjum Ahmed. Anjum is the Chief Medical Officer for AGFA Healthcare. He has been steering AGFA Healthcare's innovation strategy for enterprise imaging and artificial intelligence. And he brings with him 22 plus years of global experience in solutions innovation, governance, change management, and digital transformation. And he has published many white papers in leading societies on timely topics such as value-based care and evidence-based use of AI. So welcome to our esteemed panel. Thank you for joining us again on this occasion. So before I introduce, I think the panelists are going to introduce our two main speakers, I think we have a special treat. And like last time, so last time we had Dr. Richard Resnick from the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada give a white paper briefing on the position of the Royal College of Canada on AI. So we had to duplicate that. So we have Dr. Jaron Chong with us. So Jaron Chong I'll introduce in a second, but he's representing today the Canadian Association of Radiologists. And for those of you who don't know, the CAR is a advocacy or organization for radiologists in Canada and for patients. And they play a leading role in advancing radiology education and research in Canada, highlighted by the journal CARJ, as well as by one of the, I think is one of the best meetings in the world, the CAR Annual Scientific Meeting, which is held in Montreal every year. So speaking on behalf of CAR is Dr. Chong. So Jaron is from the University of Western Ontario, which is in London, Ontario. He's the new chair of the CAR's AI Standing Committee. Dr. Chong is a body radiologist from McGill, and he did a fellowship in cross-sectional imaging at Yale New Haven Hospital. He completed a Master of Health Informatics degree at the Institute of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation from U of T. And he is here to bring us up to date or up to speed with the CAR and AI. So before we go to you, Jaron, I think Pam has a couple of short announcements.
I just want to welcome everybody today and thank you for joining us. I'm just going to go over a couple logistics of the event today. So Like Omar said, we're going to have a short presentation from Dr. Chung, and then we will have our two keynote speakers lectures. And after each lecture, we will have a short question and answer period, which will be informal. But if you have any questions at all, you can type them in the question and answer box, and we will monitor that and get to those at the end of each talk. The session will be monitored. It'll be recorded. So we will be posting it to our AI and radiology section of the Queen's Diagnostic Radiology website. So following the session, I will be sending out that link to anybody who's registered. So you can either watch it again, or if you weren't able to catch all of it, you can catch up on what you missed, or you can pass it on to colleagues that you think might be interested in it as well. The event is a registered event for CME. So if you have answered the question that you do require a certificate when you registered for this, those will be going out in the next week or so. They will be sent to the email that you used when you registered. So really looking forward to the event, and I will pass it back to Omar and Jaron. Thank you.
So Jaron, if you want to share your screen.
Sure, not a problem.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting both the CAR on behalf of the CAR as well too. I think Omar, you've put together a really interesting conference and just a series of talks you've been able, and also the community that you've been able to bring around us, what we definitely welcome and want to see more of. So today I'm speaking on behalf of the CAR, and what I was requested to do is basically give a little bit of a progress report and an update on the CAR standing committee and where we are, and also the transition of chairs. So obviously, Ann Tang from University of Montreal has done a great and amazing job leading the former working group, now standing committee on AI, with quite a bit of work that's been done over the last 3-4 years or so. And we're entering a new phase of the committee and rebuilding and setting sort of the next steps for where we think the standing committee is headed towards. And this is sort of a little summary of what has happened recently and also what we think will happen shortly into the future. Now, for those who are not familiar with the working group and the standing committee, our general mission is effectively to try to focus upon practice, policy, patient care issues regarding the implementation of AI into healthcare, and specifically in a very Canadian context. So a lot of the policies and recommendations that we end up recommending via the white papers, our interactions both from the regulatory side as well as from the private vendor side as well too, are shaped within that appearance, and also as well the focus on our work and role as physicians too, and putting that in terms of a patient-centered orientation in terms of what our policies are set to be. Now, the overall structure and governance of that committee is basically broken up into several subcommittees: technique and apps, education, legal and ethics, guidelines, research and development. And we also have a very strong relationship as well too with the American College of Radiology, and often communicate with them to try to synchronize the work that we're doing together as well. Now, probably the number one thing that's come out from the standing committee is the series of publications that began initially with the CAR white paper on artificial intelligence in radiology, and has subsequently resulted in also as well two things on ethics and legal, kind of summary statements in conjunction with our American counterparts, as well as some more technically oriented papers such as de-identification. And some of these are actually the most cited or the most reviewed papers on CARJ. I think this is one of the longest contribution of the committee so far. Coming up in January 2022, we are releasing, we've just finished a manuscript on the assessment of radiology AI software. So that is targeted for early release just coming up in the next year, where we're actually focusing on how to actually evaluate and standardize the evaluation of potential vendor solutions or new AI solutions. In general as well too, over the last 2 or 3 months, there's been a release of what we've termed the National AI Curriculum, which is a series of modules that have been contributed from many of our members and also guest contributors as well, regarding everything from just general introduction to AI, fundamental principles, some more technically assisted talks and modules, as well as other things involving more the ethics and the legal aspects. And so this has come out quite recently. Back in April, we also have been running some member surveys, just getting kind of the mood and sentiment of the CAR membership, and as well internally the standing committee. And this kind of brings me to the crux of what is the sort of the setup for what we think is going to happen in the next 3-4 years. And it really centers on my favorite question within that CAR member survey, something known as question number 6, which is the question was phrased, since 2015, how has radiology AI changed my clinical workflow? This is, of all the questions that we asked in the survey, actually, this is the one that has almost a unilateral distribution towards 26 neutral, 34 disagree, and 39 strongly disagree. The reason why I bring this slide up, and actually it's one of those things that actually I've acknowledged in the editorial previously in the CARJ, is that from the AI side, you know, you kind of were of two camps, right? There's those of us that are in a strongly community clinical practice, clinical radiology, sort of your bread and butter, and those of us that are heavily steeped within the radiology AI community. And one of the interesting things about the CAR membership, obviously, we have a general membership as well as we have an academic membership as well too. And I often want to remind the academic members as well too that there is a completely, you know, the other side of things. This is sort of the sentiment that we're getting, that like this gives, despite the amount of attention that has been changed from an end user perspective, there's still quite a lot of work to be able to go. And so a recent article actually regarding the FDA approved algorithms, right, has actually kind of like commented on similar themes as well too, about how you know there's a large spectrum and variety of quality of AI projects that have come out. One of the main findings out of this particular article had talked about how multi-site evaluation, which is what you see pictured in the blue there in the bottom left corner, right, is still relatively rare, but is obviously increasing with each year upon year. We've certainly seen no endless supply of AI reporting guidelines, which is really where the evidence base for AI is really moving towards, things like the Spirit AI, Concert AI, or Tripod ML guidelines, things that have come out from radiology or radiology AI as well too. And we think this is actually where we're going to be really entering the maturation phase of evaluating AI solutions. From the society perspective, probably the two most kind of famous things that you'll probably encounter is like the models.acr DSI, where you can actually see FDA approved algorithms. Very recently, in just a few months prior, the FDA has actually gone directly and started releasing these SAMD listings as well too. And the CAR is actively engaged with Health Canada to try to create a Canadian equivalent of some of these listings, which you think will really help move the market in terms of the adoption of AI. But I'm going to quote, as we often like quoting for social media, some of the quotes regarding like this tension between what is a standard for regulators versus what is an end user adoption and what is clinically valuable, right? There's sort of a gap or a chasm that needs to be bridged between those things. And a lot of that is really where we're starting to see a lot of discussion and talk towards movement towards validation, real world performance, and so on and so forth. In one of our white papers, I guess we put up this like taxonomy level of like, you know, levels of automation. And one of the things then, and this comes up a lot within our interactions with Health Canada, is that we've very early on established within our white papers that we do understand that there will be applications that are only an assistant perspective, right, versus ones that are actually high or full automation as well too. But one thing that we've been very specific about is obviously the risks and the challenges with each level of autonomy are very different. And we would hope actually that the higher levels of automation, they get paired with also an increasing evidence base. And that's sort of like the core spirit or the core idea that the standing committee would like to promote. Internally, we floated a concept known as an AI validation network, where we're effectively trying to model some of the things that have been done in this very established precedent from cancer oncology trial networks as well too. And the way that we sort of like have pitched it effectively is that, you know, if you were to imagine what would a Royal College examination of AI actually look like? What are the organizational parameters? What's the data set? How would you publish? How would you list? How would you make a directory? Those kind of things. We think that this concept will probably come up not just in the Canadian context, but also in the international context as well too. And is already beginning, we're already starting to see that within the literature and evidence space as well. Some of the strategic ideas within this are actually very different, I would say, from the early phase of what we saw with international societies. So really emphasizing validation over development, with development was really seemed to be the primary emphasis as well. There's another term that we use, which is like broad, not deep data. So for sometimes a very minimal case pathology with the right mix, but relatively shallow, but representative across a whole country, could have different properties and different valuable attributes to that as well. So if you take this concept and kind of push it forward as well, too, trying to look at that long tail case of just like with with a Tesla autopilot system as well, that long tail of cases, right, we think is actually going to be quite important in order to be able to prove real world performance and also to be able to demonstrate clear value from a variety of stakeholders' perspective. So this could be anything from a radiologist trying to make a purchasing decision or a consultant position as well. From a vendor perspective, it could be with respect to liability mitigation as well as marketing, comparative performance, and certainly from a regulator perspective, which is where this discussion already came from, ensuring public safety. So there's a very complex network of discussions that go around that core concept as well too, which is, for example, how do you balance the interests of private vendors versus a government regulator? Do you ensure vendor confidentiality in valuations or not, right? How you create such a model to be sustainable? Like, are you really going from a government base versus a vendor base as well too? And then there's a sort of a nice property of validation data sets, which is that potentially it's a resource of durable value. What I mean by that is that if you extend the metaphor of what a Royal College examination is, right, the same way any test and validation set as well too, what we've seen with the open source models, obviously, right, is that there's quite a bit of transparency regarding those data sets as well. But what we're making the argument that perhaps that a data set that is regulated, of which that has or has some security level around it as well too, if appropriately representative and very accessible to potential vendors, right, will have its own value in terms of an external certification itself. And obviously, one of the other things that we're also emphasizing as well is that unlike the early and experimental and the basic science perspective of things, right, we really do want to prioritize solutions that are proposing a higher degree of automation, as well as those that are already approved or imminently approved solutions as well too, because those we think are actually most relevant for our general membership. And if you can imagine, again, same way with an RTOG trial and other trials as well too, we really want to encourage this kind of a concept, which is where you have multiple solutions feeding in, potential multi-center trial designs that are being set up and proposed and registered in some way, and potentially even multi-vendor comparisons that come out as well from that. So this roadmap, which is theoretical, you know, as of April as well, previously, just of this year, right, is something that we've really been working very hard behind the scenes to be able to figure out and get the necessary ingredients in. We've had multiple meetings with both the regulators in Health Canada, some of our counterparts at the ACR DSI, which have obviously more resources, more software tools available to bring to bear on this problem, even as well to infrastructure considerations involving AWS, how would you set up something that's multi-center as well. And some of these developments we're going to be reviewing coming up next at the RSNA timed meeting for the standing committee. The real end goal or the game of this as well too, and it's something that I think is really unique about the CAR, in comparison to some of our counterparts internationally as well too, is that we do have a very nice and working relationship with Health Canada as well too. And being able, I guess the thing I always kind of mention is that from the government and the regulator perspective as well, one of the things that's come out of those committee meetings with them, right, is that if you take a look at SAMD and AI solutions that are in the Canadian market space, nearly about 3/4 of the applications that are coming into Health Canada, 3/4 of them are actually radiology driven, right? We are effectively the number one consumer of the digital health technologies group and the solutions that they're actually processing as well. So the recommendations, the ideas that we put forth are quite relevant to what the digital health technologies group is doing. And then the second thing as well too, is that the number of applications that are coming in from a regular perspective is exponentially increasing year upon year. The barrier to entry from including small startup companies to large multi-international vendors and so forth, the number of solutions we expect is going to increase exponentially. And as a result of that, the resources, however, to regulators are not increasing exponentially as well. So what we think is that is an opportunity for scientific investigators, for everyone that's involved within radiology AI, and certainly from the CAR perspective as well, to really step up our game and offer other solutions for regulators. And we hope that this model will also be duplicated in many other regulator landscapes. That's just sort of a preview of what we think is going to be happening quite shortly. Kind of more news to come as we sort of set up some of the initial experimental designs. Hopefully, I'm hoping this dovetails into some of the subsequent talks and ideas that are going to be coming up next. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaron. Thank you. I think we will have you join the panel now, and I'm sure there'll be comments and questions, and we'll all probably take them all together. So let's move to, I think, Amber, you're going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Bloomfield.
Thanks so much, everyone, and great talk, Jaron. Agree, you should be on the panel. So thanks so much, Claire, for joining us. So Dr. Bloomfield recently joined the Center for Improving Data Collaboration as the Deputy Director for the Value of Data program. Prior to this, she was the CEO at the National Consortium of Intelligent Medical Imaging at the University of Oxford. So this was a launch pad to improve the healthcare industry through the use of AI. So very much in line with what Jaron was talking about. Her own research focused on neuroscience, and she holds a PhD in neuroscience. And she held research fellowships at Oxford, as well as at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Following her academic research career and before becoming the deputy director, she worked at the Medical Research Council and in Oxford as the head of strategy and innovation for the Cancer Research UK. And she's really been placed at the interface between academic research, industry innovation, and healthcare delivery. And her goal is really to support the ecosystem to develop effective collaborations that generate value for all stakeholders. And with that, I welcome Claire, and thank you so much for joining us. I think this is your second talk of the day, according to Twitter. If my tweeting is up to date.
You've been Twitter stalking me, yeah. So it is. So this is now 20 past 10 p.m. UK time, and I was giving a talk at about 11 a.m. this morning in London. So I've been doing a lot of talking today. It feels great to get to talk about AI and radiology a little bit more, as I've been talking more about my new role than some of the work I've been doing with NCME. So this is great to get to talk about some of this. And Jaron's fed me loads of good balls for me to hit back in terms of what we've been doing from a UK perspective. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
So I'm going to dive in, and I'm going to start with a bit of a broad angle lens from my work from the UK perspective as a whole. And then I'm going to try and dive in a little bit in terms of the work I was doing with NCME. So sort of shifting from very big to slightly narrower, to give a bit of a sense of why am I talking about health data and then into AI. And as Amber alluded to, I'm keen on collaboration across the different parts of the ecosystem. I don't think any one part of the system can do this alone. I don't think academia, clinicians, or industry have the silver bullet to fix this, but that it's through the partnerships and the different perspectives that will really reach the most impact. So that's a little bit of sort of perspective for me. I did have a disclosure slide, but it doesn't seem to have come up. So I'm just going to flag, I have previously done some consultancy work with GE Healthcare. I am an NHS employee, but I'm speaking in a personal capacity today, so not on behalf of NHSX, but we'll be giving you a couple of highlights from that. So I hope those covers disclosures. So as I say, I'm going to give a little bit of a perspective from the NHS and then NCME and why that was relevant and important, and where I think some of the challenges and opportunities have been from the UK and where this might take us next. There's been a long history of the idea of data being valuable for research purposes and driving insights in health. I was fortunate to work at Oxford University, where the link between smoking and lung cancer was first discovered through population health studies back in the 1950s by Richard Dole. And that was large-scale epidemiological uses of data, which has shifted and expanded through a range of different applications, both in clinical research, clinical data in population levels, as well as AI tools, precision medicine, device trials. And really, as data is potentially overhyped, although I like to think no, maybe not too much, because now my role is to harness the value of that data. So keen on thinking about how we use that and apply that to enhance the capabilities of healthcare professionals to do more and to focus on the patients in front of them rather than either the admin burden or the decisions that their expertise is not so necessary for. So it's an overused phrase, but a combination of data and AI with the healthcare professionals rather than against the healthcare professionals. and that we can in tandem support the most impact by supporting those tools available to us through data. In my current role from an NHS perspective, there have been 3 key drivers of strategic vision that are underpinning a lot of the work, where really pre-pandemic, but reflecting a lot of the insights that were generated over the last 18 months about the potential of clinical research and data-driven insights to rapidly inform clinical decision-making, to drive new research at speed and scale, and to have significant impact on both the national and global stage. That the life science division was constructed. And that's focused on enabling life sciences as an industry to engage with the UK as a global leader in terms of the uses of health data, and is both mission-led in terms of focusing on cancer, cardiovascular disease, dementia, as well as data and other enabling platforms to support that. In terms of healthcare delivery, the NHS long-term plan also looks at directly embedding research into the delivery of care to make sure that we're not decoupling those different processes. And the talk I was giving this morning was with the Clinical Research Network across the UK around some of our ambitions around clinical research delivery, and thinking about how the lessons learned, hopefully from COVID, can create a COVID bounce, that we can use those data insights that we were able to come together around COVID and roll that out at a larger, broader scale for a range of different use cases and data types. What do I do now? So I work within the Centre for Improving Data Collaboration, which name is helpfully on the tin. So we exist to support enhancing the collaboration between industry, academia, and the NHS for the use of health data sets, and both ensuring that there is access for researchers and industry to those data sets, but also ensuring that the NHS and patients benefit from that access, and ensuring that we're not only just accelerating benefit out into the system, but ensuring we get innovation and impact back into the system, and ensuring there's a fair exchange of value between those strands. I joined the CIDC in June, and was really keen to bring some of the work and my experiences from trying to harness the potential value of imaging data for AI into this broader landscape, and oversee now investments across genomics, imaging, real world data, national trusted research environments, and clinical research infrastructure. And this is the start of what's going to be a large range of investments to focus on how we deliver at scale data infrastructure to make it easier and more effective for innovators to engage, but to realise some of that potential that's locked into those health data sets, and particularly for the NHS around the longitudinal data that exists in the NHS care record, and how we make sure that we use the most insights out of those data sets. AI is peppered throughout there as being one of the key opportunities that has the potential to be realised. And this graph summarises where healthcare sits compared to other domains in terms of AI adoption as a proportion of companies versus the future demand for those. And healthcare is really sat in the middle as a sort of golden opportunity where it's not yet leading. There's a lot of unmet potential, but really that we need to focus on where it can have impact, where it can enhance clinical impact and meet either unmet needs or will support clinical decision-making in a way that is actually useful and can be embedded into clinical care. And that goal or that gap in the market is partly where NCME came from. So NCME was set up in 2019 and was with the goal of supporting AI medical imaging enhancements and collaboration through academic, industry, NHS and patient collaboration, and through the sharing of healthcare record data sets and image data to support AI development, testing, training, validation and deployment. So the full range of translation from early stage R&D through to deployment back into healthcare delivery. And that network of NCME spanned 14 NHS trusts, so 14 healthcare delivery units, hospitals that collectively had about a patient population of about 18 million and spread geographically across the UK, which was quite intentional and speaks to Jaron's point around types of data that are used and the need, particularly around real world data and validation of diverse data sets. And this is something we were really keen to embed from the start, that we were collecting, collating and curating data from different socioeconomic, ethnic backgrounds, as well as different types of specialist or more regional district general hospitals that have different imaging tech capabilities, different tech platforms, and different patient bases. and that by bringing those different hospitals together, we could support the gathering of sufficient imaging data to develop new imaging AI solutions that could be tested, trained, and then deployed back into those environments to assess their real-world validity and application back within the care pathways. The goal, and this was underpinned by funding from government, and NCME is still running. So I was fortunate to head up NCME from its inception and before I moved on to the CIDC, and it's still working with now 15, I think we're up to 15 different company partners across a range of different clinical use cases. But to ensure that those multimodal clinical imaging AI projects were not just being generated and sitting in academic spaces, but were being deployed back into care. And that the patient perspective and the charity voice of patients was integrated into what data was used, how it was used, what commercial uses that was directed to, and what the return back for the uses of those data sets were, so that it was considered an ethical mechanism by which industry were engaging with the generating of new solutions. There was an unmet need, and this very much picks up some UK landscape, and it's slightly out of date, some of this information now, but still reflects that particularly within AI imaging and radiology, there's a significant workforce shortage, which ranges from 33 to 43% nationally, depending on where in the country you're sat. There is a significant backlog in terms of review of scans, and that isn't going anywhere. Even with plans in terms of expansion of workforce, there is not going to be sufficient trainees to address the backlog of imaging and the expansion around new needs and new use cases for imaging that are ever increasing beyond the ability for the radiology community to keep up. And so this is the potential that AI can be a helping hand to support the triaging and manage some of that work backlog, as well as opportunities around precision medicine or new radiomic or other insights that can be generated that a human would be unable to detect, but through the combination of medical imaging, pathology, genomics, we can generate new insights to improve patient care. One of the examples I wanted to flag, and I will, hopefully Omar can give the story about Queen's long history with X-ray imaging, was an example where we were working with GE Healthcare around pneumothoraces and never events and NG tube placements. This, at least in the UK, is considered, a never event is considered something that quite literally should never happen, and there are financial penalties for hospitals if these incur. So if a nasogastric tube is incorrectly positioned and isn't checked on the X-ray, you can end up with feeding into the lung or elsewhere into the body, and it can be fatal. Often these are being picked up in A&E departments, ER departments, or by junior staff overnight that are not as well trained as a specialist radiologist would be. And therefore there is a higher risk that either they're missed or that they're not triaged appropriately, so the cases are being reviewed as well as they should be. And so this unmet need presents a significant issue within the NHS system. And so we were working with GE to really think through how we could use, work with them around a chest X-ray critical care suite of algorithms that would support not only NGT placement, but looking for pneumothoraces detection, and a suite of these integrated onto a mobile X-ray unit where they could be used by non-specialist workforce to support in the triaging and review of these cases. We've supported them with image acquisition and collection and EHR data for the training and development and testing of these algorithms, as well as, and I'm hoping Jaron will like this news, a real world validation of these as well. So looking at taking a cross-hospital cohort of senior radiologists, junior radiologists, radiographers or technicians, and other areas of the clinical teams to review their performance with and without the AI against new imaging that the algorithm hasn't seen in a real life setting. So trying to provide and generate some of that real world evidence that sits on top of an algorithm that's already been through FDA clearance, because we consider that being one of the critical areas where you do need evidence post FDA and CE marking to demonstrate how this will integrate into care and that it actually works in the wild. So this particular example shows the detection in red on the chest X-ray image of the detection of the pneumothorax can then be triaged and reviewed by the professionals. So it's flagging the cases. It's not making an automated decision without radiologist oversight, but it's helping to filter the cases and get the critical ones up for review as quickly as possible. And as I say, it's just going through a real world evaluation at the moment with 6 of the hospitals across NCME's network. So that was an example that I wanted to flag where they're picking this up. I wasn't going to test the radiologists whether you could pick them up, but we do sometimes do that. So I'm going to shift back out a little bit from that specific example to give a broader perspective back into where do I think some of the barriers sit for AI, but data uses broadly in terms of what we could be doing in terms of realizing its potential. And I've grouped these into 3 clusters. The top ones are the areas of barriers across technological, operational, and people barriers, which unsurprisingly, they are diverse, broad-ranging. They don't just apply to AI or even just to health data, but the whole process of innovation and integration of novel research into practice. These also, though, represent some of the areas that I think are the key opportunities for bringing together and enabling more activity, where you can bring together this collaborative way of working, bringing together different parts of the ecosystem, where you can bring the best expertise to tackle some of those considerations around the many V's of data, some of the operational components about ethical information governance processes and who accesses and how they access, the value of those data sets and who benefits financially or otherwise in terms of that data sharing. And then also overcoming some of the hurdles around people's perception of AI and a willingness to adopt, even if there's good evidence in the system that they should be doing so. And this is really where I think that there is this huge potential for us to collectively link those groups together to support a partnership approach, which is what we explored with NCME and what I'm looking to support further through some of the work I'm now undertaking within the Centre for Improving Data Collaboration, about bringing those different perspectives to the table to really ensure that value is created for everybody, but also that we don't misstep and we don't make lessons learned from previous innovations and processes, so that you can optimize this and get this deployed as quickly as possible. And doing that through infrastructure in the case of my work within the CIDC, but also thinking around those people components, which is why I like to talk about some of the work we're doing to really bring more people on board the idea that AI is definitely something worth doing. It's not going anywhere, but good AI is the right way to go, and that involves building the right partnerships, collaborations, and listening to the clinical experts to make sure we design this for them and in a way that patients and the public can trust us that we're doing the right things with their data. And that's up all for me, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions afterwards. And I hope I'm not gone too croaky after this, after all my talking.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
I guess it's me now. I think we'll move on to the next talk, and then we'll swing back for all the Q&A. And I see there's some people who are entering some questions and comments in the chat, so thank you for that. Let's see, so Errol's going to introduce our next speaker from Brazil. Errol, floor is yours.
Thanks. Dr. Felipe Kitamura will be our next speaker. He's a board-certified neuroradiologist at Universidade Federal de São Paulo in Brazil, or UniFesp in short. He is the head of innovation and diagnostic operations at DASA, which is Brazil's largest integrated healthcare network that currently takes care of the journey of more than 20 million patients per year. Dr. Kitamura received his master's degree in genetics and biotechnology at UFJF and his PhD in clinical radiology, focusing on artificial intelligence in radiology at UniFesp. He also contributes to the Machine Learning Challenge Task Force at the Radiologic Society of North America, and he also serves as an active member of the Scientific Program Committee in the Radiology Informatics section. In addition, he has served as the in-training deputy editor for the journal Radiology and has collaborated with many people who have inspired him to achieve the status of master in many Kaggle competitions. I view Dr. Kitamura as an expert in both medical imaging and artificial intelligence, and I think you'll really enjoy his talk. He has a lot of insight in this area.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Arrow, and thank you all the organizers for inviting me here today. I think you have all raised the bar. Congratulations to Dr. Chong and Dr. Bloomfield for your presentations here. My talk is a little bit, my talk goes in different direction. I'm gonna talk about use cases of AI in neuroradiology. We could talk about chest imaging or breast imaging, which are also areas that have a lot of AI being developed in the past years, but just because I'm a neuroradiologist, I thought it would be better to focus on this topic. These are my disclosures. I'm a consultant for NGAI and for GE Healthcare. So AI in neuroradiology, I think it all starts at the same moment we had Windows 3. Some of you may remember this, some of you may not, because I think it's been a while. I think it's been more than 20 years that's being said here. But as of that moment, we had this paper published in Radiographics describing this AI program for the diagnosis of brain lesions in radiological imaging, specifically MRI. And what they called AI at the moment was mostly a decision tree based on rules that people thought would be better, like you can see here in this very pictorial window. But what happened from now, from that moment until now, was we had a lot of development. We had an AI winter, maybe at that same moment. And after deep learning started to really work, as Alex showed with AlexNet in 2012, and everyone was excited about using AI in medicine, and not only in medicine, but in every sector of industry. We had a lot of things that were developed. And what I'm going to show you here is some of the researches that have appeared. Just bear with me that most of them are not robust, safe, clinically ready products. Most of them are research, are proof of concept. But still, I think it's interesting to see what's there and what's being developed. And that may give us a hint of what may happen to radiology in a few years. I have divided the applications I found in these 5 major topics, depending on how the model was built. So we have classification, which are models that would classify an entire study or a series or an image into one or more classes. These classes could be different kinds of diseases. We have detection models that what they do exactly is putting a bounding box around a lesion so you can localize where the lesion is. We also have segmentation models that are used to exactly draw the lesion, and this can be used to quantify area and volume of any body part in any lesion. We have generative models that are used to generate new images from raw images or from any kind of input. We're going to see some examples of that. And also image mapping, which for me is the most interesting part of AI in neuroradiology. So let's start talking about classification. This was an interesting paper that showed a very different use case of AI. They're not trying to find lesions or find brain tumors or anything else. They're just trying to find MRI sequences that had major artifacts that would make the image reading not feasible. And by creating that kind of model, their expectation was that they could deploy that onto the scanner and have that information ready so the tech could repeat the sequence while the patient is still in the scanner, and that could reduce both rescan and recall rates. This is like, sometimes people tell me, I'm interested about applications where AI is going to find something, find lesion, and tell me what it is. But this has nothing to do with that. But still, I think it proves a point that we can use AI to be more efficient and reduce the costs of healthcare in general. Another interesting use case, maybe at least the first one that I've seen published in radiology, to detect critical findings in head CTs, was this paper published in Radiology, where the authors created a model that would find the most common critical findings in head CTs, like hydrocephalus, hemorrhage, or mass effect, or even those subtle signs of stroke. And then they would use that to prioritize the study in the work list. So the radiologist would report first the studies that are more critical. And just a while after that paper, we had this other paper here from, so this first paper was led by Luciano Prevedello, who was in charge of the machine learning steering committee at RSNA last year. Now I think it's John Mongan. But after that paper, we had our friends in India, mostly with Vidur, Vasant, and Prashant Warrior. And they published this interesting paper that did quite similar to the first one I showed. But in this case, they found they were able to detect more critical findings in head CTs. And as far as I remember, I think this was the largest retrospective study in creating models with head CTs at that time. But we can use AI to do different things. For example, these researchers found that by using multiple sequences from MRI, along with demographic and also tumor and clinical data, they were able to estimate how long a patient would survive. And this is something that is quite difficult to do. I mean, patients who have severe diseases, they usually are worried about how long they're going to live, and we are just not able to provide that good estimate for them. And by using AI, these authors have showed that we can narrow down our error a lot. We can also use AI to diagnose Parkinson's disease. In this case, it's based on nuclear medicine, but still any kind of imaging could be used. This was another interesting paper that showed we can differentiate patients who will develop Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment. The area under the curve for most of these models is not perfect. Some of them are not externally validated, but I think this gives us an idea of what is about to come in the next years as we make these tools more robust over time. And one interesting thing about this paper is that they were able to predict the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease 1 or 5 years ahead of time before the patient had clinical symptoms, based on also nuclear medicine. Another quite interesting paper, in my opinion, was this one that was led by Andres. They developed a model that was able to differentiate the most common and also some uncommon brain diseases from brain MRI. And the interesting thing about this paper is that we usually have that idea that deep learning needs a lot of data. As we are dealing with supervised learning, we need a lot of cases for each class, for each disease, so we can build a classifier. And they have changed this paradigm by using not only deep learning, but also Bayesian inference And by doing that, they were able to use a lot less cases for each of these diseases, and still they performed better than residents, than general radiologists, and then neuroradiology fellows, and they performed similar to academic neuroradiologists. This was one of the most interesting papers I've seen so far. We can use AI not only in radiology, but also in digital pathology. In this case, what they did was they tried to predict if a glioma would have a specific mutation or not based on just the plain simple slide from pathology, which is striking if you ask a pathologist. This is something that is almost impossible to be done, and people have done the same also for MRI. So by using MRI sequences, one can predict if a glioma has methylation of the MGMT promoter or 1q19q co-deletion or IDH1 mutation. I mean, these are all just, if you're not a neuroradiologist, bear with me. These are just mutations that are important to be characterized in brain tumors. And what they did here in this paper and in many other papers was to develop a deep learning model that is able to predict if a tumor has these mutations or not from the brain MRI. And also this year's RSNA challenge with MICAI and ASNR is based on this application, on trying to build a model that is able to predict MGMT status from MRI. We can use also deep learning to, I mean, in this case, they used functional MRI. It's not like plain MRI, but they were able to have a quite nice area under the curve to characterize if the patient has attention deficit or not. So these are some use cases of classification. In terms of detection, which is putting a bounding box around the lesion, one of the most interesting papers I have seen is this one, where the authors were able to spot aneurysms in brain CTs, in brain angiograms. And that's basically the idea. You're going to put a bounding box around some lesions. I think there are many other use cases for that in lung nodules, and you can also use that for breast cancer. But this was the most prominent use case I found in neuroradiology. In terms of segmentation, segmentation is a little bit different. You're not putting a bounding box around something. You're actually drawing the contour of a lesion. And to do that, people use basically, this was the first successful architecture that was described to do segmentation in biomedical images created by Olaf. And this is called UNet. We had a lot other networks after that, Deep Lab V3 and other ones. But the idea is that you can actually segment any body part you want. In this case, I found this quite interesting because they had a very different application here. I'm not interventional, maybe some of you are. And one thing they tell in this paper is that there's this safe triangle when you're doing spinal intervention in lumbosacral spine. There's this safe triangle and this scamming triangle that are important when you're planning your injection. And it's quite time consuming to contour all the lumbosacral nerves to have that planned in 3D. And by using a deep learning model, you can do that as fast as the blink of an eye. And that's what they propose here in this paper. You can also use segmentation models to quantify the volume of brain lesions, in this case, brain tumors. You can quantify the volume of the enhancing area of the necrosis, and also the edema or infiltrating brain around the tumor. In terms of generative models, there are also a lot of examples, but the basic idea was of GANs, or generative adversarial networks, was developed by Ian Godfellow, Joshua Benjo, and other researchers in Canada. And this is a quite interesting idea. You create a, I'm not gonna delve into the technical details of this, but basically it's like if you had two models, one would be someone trying to create fake documents, but as close to real documents as possible. And the other person would be like the cop who tries to identify fake documents. And then you put those two to fight against each other. And in the end, you get someone who is able to create fake documents that look a lot like real ones. You can use that idea to do many different things. Deepfake is based on this as well. And what people have tried to do is to generate one image from the other. For example, in this case, they are generating T2 from T1. I don't think this is something safe to be done, because we know sometimes we see lesions on T2 that are not visible on T1. Maybe the other way around would be safer, but the idea is maybe we can generate images from other modalities and we can be more efficient, gain time, or just being more efficient in healthcare. And there are really many ways we can use that. I think to characterize lesions, I think this is something that still bothers me, to create one sequence from the other. But one application that I think is useful and maybe also safe would be to generate a head CT from a brain MRI. And you may ask why someone would do that. And the main reason someone would do that is because some patients who have brain tumors may need to undergo radiotherapy. And to plan radiotherapy, we need a head CT because of the electron density in the skull. And sometimes these patients have a lot of MRI scans, but they don't have a single brain CT, head CT. And you would have to do that, and also more radiation to the patient as you're doing one more head CT. If you're able to generate a CT from the MRI, then maybe the CT would not be needed. And it also makes the healthcare system more efficient, not only reducing radiation to this patient. One thing that I thought was, we're not interested in characterizing details in bone lesions here. In this case, I think this technique would not be appropriate. We're just trying to have a rough estimate of the skull dimensions of this patient. And they have shown in this paper that it works pretty well. In terms of image mapping, to do that, you can use similar architectures as UNet. If you tweak it a little bit, or many other architectures. But the basic idea, you're going to get as input an image, and the output is going to be almost the same image, but with or without a specific feature that you want. In this case, these authors developed this deep learning model that is able to improve ASL acquisition. ASL is perfusion without contrast in the brain, for those who are neuro or not neuro, if you have not seen that yet. But the main problem with ASL is that this sequence takes a lot of time to be acquired, and it usually produces low resolution images. And by using deep learning, you can map low resolution images to higher resolution images. And you can use that just to increase quality, or you can use that in the trade-off of MRI to make faster acquisitions as well. Another quite interesting applications done by these researchers in Stanford is that you can use pre-contrast Q1 plus low dose to 1 with only 10% of the dose of gadolinium to generate an image that is similar to 100% dose of gadolinium. They started this a few years ago. I saw some examples of that. I would say 5 years ago, it looked nice, but not perfect. But the last examples I've seen recently are quite promising. And I think this would be most useful for patients who need to go to perform MRIs every year, like patients with multiple sclerosis who need contrast enhanced sequences. Maybe we could reduce that dose. I mean, there's a long way in terms of testing the safety and validating these tools. If we're not going to miss small enhancing lesions, there's all that still in place, but I think the idea is quite promising. And people are also using deep learning to reconstruct brain MRI from case space. I mean, there are many ways to do that today, and I'm pretty sure all the vendors work to optimize this step. But what I found interesting in this AutoMap solution that these authors from MGH found was that by using a neural network to reconstruct an image from case space, they are actually able to reduce the noise and the error from the reconstruction. For example, in this case, where we have this misaligned case space, we usually get this kind of reconstruction with these ghosting artifacts. And using AutoMap, we didn't have that. That's something that surprised me. In terms of use cases in neuro, I think that's mostly what I wanted to say. And I wanted to also talk about this paper that Arrow also collaborated on with RSNA and ASMR in 2019, which was the development of the largest brain CT hemorrhage data set at that moment, and maybe still today. And this data set was used for the RSNA challenge that year, and it's public and can be used to foster machine learning research. If any of you are interested in this field, you can download that data set to do your research if you want. If you're interested in knowing more about deep learning in neuroradiology, there are many reviews out there. This is a systematic review that Anthony worked on, and Ian and Derek. I would also recommend if you're interested in looking for other applications. All of that I said and so far is related to research. But if you're interested in products, I think this is a nice technographic review that shows many products from many companies. And if you're looking for products to validate in your own institution, I think this is a nice paper to take a look at. There are many companies out there. This is a nice slide from RSNA showing some of these companies who are building products using deep learning, not only in neuro. And I would finish showing this neat slide that was created by Hugh Harvey from England, where he shows that although we as radiologists are usually concerned and looking for use cases of AI in the perception and reasoning part of the imaging cycle, we can use AI in all other steps of the imaging cycle. And maybe in those steps, we can even make radiology more efficient. And to finalize, I would like to give you an idea of what I think in terms of AI in radiology. People say I'm too romantic, and that's fine. You may not agree with what I'm going to say here now, but that's completely fine, and we can discuss that later on. But the idea is that we have to understand this. Radiology has always been a great profession, but the truth is times have changed and professions change. We have to acknowledge the pride of being a radiologist is over. No one will believe that radiology will change for the better. Everybody needs to know radiologists will have no value. You shouldn't believe when somebody says radiology is being reinvented. However, sometimes we need to see things in a different way. Radiology is being reinvented. You shouldn't believe when somebody says radiologists will have no value. Everybody needs to know radiology will change for the better. No one will believe that the pride of being a radiologist is over. We have to acknowledge times have changed and professions change, but the truth is radiology has always been a great profession. We have to understand this. That's it. Thank you very much. Thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Felipe. That was wonderful. Really enjoyed that. Enjoyed all of our speakers. I'm sure we have lots of questions and comments. I know I was madly scribbling stuff down, lots of interesting points I have to ask you guys stuff as well. But perhaps, Anjum, you can take over here and see what we have in our Q&A and chat boxes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Fascinated and thought-provoking discussion today. Thank you so much, Dr. Chong, Dr. Bloomfield, and Dr. Kitamura as well. It opens up a dialogue, right, in regards to how do we bring all this information together? Because Dr. Chong, when you were talking initially about the regulatory aspect in Canada, and when Dr. Bloomfield spoke about what the work that NHS is doing, and I have also been very much involved in some of those conversations at NHS level and the implementation of AI. So the first question, I'll frame it in more of a regulatory perspective, because there is somewhere we need to see how we marry the discussion between the research aspect of AI and the actual clinical application of artificial intelligence in clinical practice. Now, when we look at how these AI applications are evaluated, the question that comes is, whether you look at the CE mark in Europe or the way, how things are going to go towards regulatory clearance in the UK, Health Canada versus FDA, is there a consensus building up between these esteemed bodies in regards to, standardizing an approach in regards to how these AI algorithms need to be evaluated and regulatory cleared? I'll start with Dr. Chong, perhaps.
Sure. And I'm actually seeing as well too the Q&A and chat questions. That's an excellent question, right? I think there was one of the comments from in the panelist chat as well too, about the difficulties from a small vendor perspective, from a startup perspective as well. The thing that I find interesting about that is that this consensus building between the regulators in different countries, different organizations, the FDA and Health Canada, for example, it's taken a very long time to get that consensus between. More pertinent to one of the questions that was asked in the Q&A, right? There is something I'm aware of called the IMDRF, right? It's a medical device forum. This is involving Australia, Brazil, Canada, the US, Europe, China, Russia, and so forth, where the regulators in the respective countries are talking to each other. Like, it's a very small community, regulator community. You're talking like 30 people in Canada, you're talking a few hundred in FDA, right? But they all obviously have to compare notes with each other as well. And we are starting to see some synchronization. So the regulators that are initiating and setting policies first are secondarily influencing the regulators in other countries as well too. Where we have seen that immediately occur with respect to Health Canada, for example, is that there's currently a very active debate right now. Health Canada is under some sort of pressure effectively to come to a policy ruling regarding adaptive or unlocked algorithms, right? The messages that they're getting from vendors and from companies is that obviously one of the advantages of deep learning is the ability to accrue and retrain very quickly, especially with some of those feedback models that we've seen in terms of, like, if you don't agree that pneumothorax is there, well, you say, no, I don't agree. It would be a real shame to not use that data point, right? And the issue that we're running into is that the regulator concept is based on the idea of a fixed model, sort of like an insulin pump, sort of like an EKG monitor sort of a thing, right? You deploy it, you can't really change it that much as well too. And so there's sort of a quasi gray zone right now for sites that are developing algorithms that are in-house for primary, like use or personal use sort of, right? There's a bit more flexibility in that. But when it's a go-to-market situation, right, then there's less flexibility. And Health Canada is trying to find a balance between safety versus, like the actual applications over there. And a lot of that, the US is the most aggressive and is the most progressive, right, in approving that and giving out approvals for it. Health Canada is trying to find some sort of compromise solution between. So regarding, is there going to be consensus? I think there will be, but it takes a lot of case examples, right? And particularly vendors that are capable of the way Health Canada has phrased it, which I find is kind of interesting, is that they're willing to forego some of the earlier stage processes with respect to go to market, lower the barrier a little bit, but they feel that there therefore needs to be a higher monitoring, higher amount of post-market surveillance, right? Given the less scrutiny at the early part as well. And so there's sort of a risk balance there. If you don't like, and the reason why that I think is a very interesting and very nuanced argument is because it actually allows innovation, especially for low resource organizations.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Chong. Anyone from the panelists, if you want to comment further on this from your perspective? Maybe we can start with Dr. Bloomfield first, what you have seen in the UK in regards to evaluation and implementation of this, specifically what I've seen with the NHS X AI award, which has certain phases, phase 4, phase 3, in terms of how mature these algorithms are.
Happy to. So, and the AI lab has certainly gone some way, particularly around focusing around the barrier between development and regulatory clearance and then into adoption, which is still a gap that even post regulatory clearance, you're still not seeing the uptake of the technologies that have been approved into the market. So there's still a gap there. And I think that's where post-market surveillance or clinical validation post-regulatory clearance is where you start to generate the evidence that clinical communities actually want to see that this will work in their patients with their data and their cohorts with their scanning systems and integrate into the care pathway, which I think is one of the real gaps that the AI is often tested in isolation and doesn't consider what the existing workflows are. So it can work well in a testing training environment, it can work well for regulatory clearance, but it still doesn't work in the wild. And that's not a regulatory problem, but it is certainly a problem around how you're testing and the roadmap for deployment of AI that I don't think is being considered. There was a paper relatively recently this year of the 100 CE marked radiology solutions in Europe. So the FDA, only 36 of them had multi-site post-evaluation, not external data sets of the 100. So you think of the rest of those that are going out and being used and they're not being robust and they fall over. And then the next one that comes through the pipeline, nobody wants to use it because the last one they used wasn't robust and didn't work. So you perpetuate this problem. In terms of the regulatory piece, though, specifically, I think the FDA has actually done a great job with this in terms of it's been proactive in thinking about some of this in the way that the UK has actually been on the back foot a little bit in terms of particularly thinking about adaptive AI. One of the things we're looking at in terms of my portfolio investments over the next few years is going to be real world data TREs and looking to embed AI trials into real world evidence data sets into regional real world locations to try and help to tackle some of this and to think about embedding some of the evidence generation. Post-market surveillance isn't well embedded into the care system, so it's hard to generate the data you actually need to then prove that you can robustly regulate them. So there's not quite a chicken and an egg problem at the moment, but it feels like that's kind of the catch-22 for some of this.
This lets me think about this from this perspective, right? Whether you are using for academic or research purpose versus you taking this particular algorithm to your clinical use. And that's where I'll look at Dr. Kitamura, because when you are generating that evidence, I think the challenge which we have seen with some of the early adopters of commercially available AI algorithms is, how do I evaluate this? How do I know where is the evidence coming from? Because you do have lots of retrospective data that talks about sensitivity, specificity, the AUC numbers. But then what about, clinical practice? How does it improve care outcomes? Yes, it is detecting or identifying a certain nodule, but so what? How do you tie this together into this evidence-based evaluation?
I think that's a great point, Anjan. I'll tell you what we've been trying to do in the past years while evaluating models from companies, models that we wanted to use. And I don't think there's a right answer for that and a neat solution for that. But doing the local validation, I think that's quite important, like you have shown here already. It doesn't matter if the product is already cleared, FDA cleared, or CE mark cleared, or even in Brazil, the Anvisa clearance, we still have to validate in our own data. And this retrospective part is quite important for us because it gives us an idea if the model is generalizing our data or not. But even after doing that, we're still not, we still don't know if the model is going to perform well in the wild, in real life, in the prospective use. And not only that, but even if the model works, how can I measure the benefit of using it? And what benefit is that? And as we have not done anything similar before, we don't have KPIs in place. So if we start measuring now, how can we compare to see if things are, we would have to create a clinical trial and test side by side and see what happens. That's quite expensive. It takes a lot of time. And after you have finished, then the vendor says, I have version 2, which is quite different from this one. And how are you going to deal with that? I think that's still a problem that we have. And at least from my perspective, I haven't seen a technical answer, good answer for that.
This is the reality of innovation, right? That's when you introduce innovation, there is a cycle that it goes through where there is the Gartner hype that we talk about. But interesting, Dr. Simpson, your thoughts on this?
I think it's a relevant question to ask in the time of COVID-19, right? That we really thought AI was going to revolutionize the world. And I have to say, I think we kind of dropped the ball. And there's even been papers about this recently, about the hope and hype of AI around COVID-19 and how things haven't played out the way that we wanted. I think at the end of the day, you have to make something that's useful for clinicians, the person that's actually sitting at the PAC station, to use. And we've tried this for a long time, right? We did this with CAD. This cycle of AI isn't the first one. And so I think cracking that nut is a challenge. But to Claire's point, you really have to think about the clinical workflow. What is the series of events that a radiologist is doing, and how can you intervene in that in a way that makes sense for them?
Dr. Kolak?
The other thing we have to take into account is the behavior of the end user. How do we measure and assess whether or not the radiologist or whatever clinician is being over-reliant on an algorithm, which in itself might not be aware of when it's operating outside its bounds of safety? Are people going to rely on a negative inference from a machine learning model to say, okay, I can get through this case quickly because it hasn't been flagged positive for whatever pathology? Also, when do you present the machine learning inference to a user? Should it be a double read after they've looked at it? So it's a true double read. Will they be biased if they're given the information up front? So there's a lot of areas that are very underexplored. So the impact on clinical workflow is multifaceted. And I think very often we forget about the behavior of end users. And studies looking at mammography and CAD have shown that CAD affects different experiences and expertise of mammography readers differently. So less experienced, or I don't want to use the term poorer, interpreters of mammograms might be affected differently than from experts. So we really need to explore that area.
It's an interesting corollary to that, though, I think, around the quality of radiologist performance as a benchmark. So there is variability within radiologist performance. There is variability in the risk potential around AI. And there's an interesting, I think, ethical question around, do you want to use AI where you standardize that risk across a large population where you're using that AI? Or are you more comfortable with the variability between individual clinical decision-making and the patterns that generates in the system? But I think that nobody, as far as I'm aware, has been assessing and categorizing clinical performance and then comparing that in terms of impact in that location with the AI. And are there national or global benefits for altering where you're holding the risk in the system? I don't know, like, as an individual patient, one ethical decision. On a global scale, does it start to look slightly different in terms of your risk perception?
Great point. Very great point.
Very good point, Dr. Omar. If I were to come to you and propose that I have an AI algorithm, I'm developing something, how would you go about assessing, if, let's say it fascinates you, yeah, this is the use case you're interested in. Would you be looking at first, the regulatory aspect, whether it is Health Canada cleared or if it is FDA cleared? Yes, you may want to try it. This also comes up in clinical discussions with the hospitals and health authorities, that how do I select a particular algorithm? Should I wait for Health Canada clearance before I, test it or validate? What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. Well, I think that would be the safe way to go. Safety first. I'm not sure that's the smartest way to go. Certainly, as a if I'm a typical end user, which I am in neuro, I would prefer to have something that's being validated and approved, whether it's FDA or Health Canada or another agency. I don't think I could necessarily mean that I could trust it or rely on it. And I think Jaren brought that point up. Just because a device or a product is approved for use, it doesn't mean it works. It's it may be safe, but it doesn't mean it will enhance your productivity or improve your diagnosis or help the patient. So you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt. Now, a lot of these things, if they are embedded in your PACS or in your workflow, you may not know it exists, right? And that's the danger here, where then you don't know why that chest X-ray came to the top of your list, or don't know the inner workings why that chest X-ray came to the top of your list, and why you had to report that one first over the other 20. And it may not work, and the 20th X-ray may have been the most important one, and you've been working the wrong way for years, using that algorithm. What I found really useful, I think, which will be useful for me, perhaps for other people, at least in neuro, is some of these prognostication models that tell me, is this lesion going to enlarge over 5 years from now, or is this normal brain MR? The brain MR is normal, patient has a headache. Well, 5 years from now, we know this patient has a glioma. So was there something 5 years before that could have predicted that this patient would have a glioma? And I think a lot of work has been done in mammo and breast screening in that regard. So I think that's it. I had a case 2 days ago where a patient asked about a tiny Rathke's cleft cyst, a little pituitary cyst. Is this going to enlarge? Is it going to cause me problems 5 years from 10? What's my follow-up? Like, should I get this checked every 6 months? And I had no answer for that, right? I can say that, these are benign, they're simple, they don't change over time, et cetera. But if there was a predictive model that I could use or apply or consult on, I think that would be very useful. And that may not require the same robust regulatory challenge if I'm using a predictive model, because it may not necessarily impact what I do that day or tomorrow. It may be just an opinion I provide for future care. So I think those predictive models or prognostic models, I think in neuro would be most powerful.
How do you see in the context of radiology, there is the evolving framework around precision health, precision medicine. There's talk about genomic data as well. And I understand in the UK, there are the genome project going on as well. How do you see this on a population health level? Because in the end, we are talking about patient outcomes, improving patient care and delivering better care. So if we want to be predictive, shouldn't we be looking at in this whole context of how AI generated machine learning data, image analysis is tied into patient risk profile with precision medicine, with genomic data? Have there been thoughts around this?
That's an excellent point. I think we have to realize that radiology can't do this alone. And if we try to do it just based on radiology data alone, we're gonna fail at especially these predictive or prognostication models, because a lot of that depends upon, as you said, genomic data, patient, other lab data, and I think we need to. Sorry, there's a fire. There's a fake fire alarm. So until we have all of that data all in one kind of crystal ball, so to speak. And I think that would be a powerful tool. And I think we got to include pathology data, and we include laboratory data, genetic data into some of our predictive radiology models. Otherwise, I think it's flawed and incomplete.
Surgeons that I've worked with say it's all in the ankles. Just look at the ankles. But I guess this group doesn't usually look at the ankles.
I think, Omar, you're potentially doing radiology a disservice there. I think the inverse has been true, that there's been a lot of assumptions around risk stratification without including imaging, and that you don't need the imaging and you can do it off genomics and EHR. And there's a huge wealth of value in imaging biomarkers for earlier predictive outcomes than you would see in other indications. And so I think I rather controversially at RSNA last year said that I didn't think radiology would be called radiology in 10 years' time, because you could imagine it as becoming more intricative and integrating the genomics, the pathology, into a much more holistic view of how you're making decision making that isn't just the DICOM in front of you. It does need to incorporate those different components. It was to a room of radiologists though, so I'm not sure I convinced everybody that was the way to head, but that multimodal data is the way you actually make decisions, and you do that in your clinical practice now. And so AI needs to do the same. You don't just look at the image and not look at any of the rest of the information about the patient for the scan. So AI's got to work in the same way that clinicians work, I think.
Yeah, just to add to your point, I think we have a good example of that nowadays, which is using ultrasound for fetal imaging along with biochemistry to predict the risk of syndromes. And that could be expanded in, to your point, and more generalized to use images and other tests together.
We're doing it around lung cancer at the moment. So the National Screening Programme's looking at combining digital pathology and CT, PET-CT images. So you can look at correlating the tumour between the pathology, digipath, and the CT scans. So it's emerging, but I think there's still a way to go in terms of digitizing pathology to be able to keep up with the radiology images. So there's, maybe genomics and images, or EHR and images is the place to start.
I'm curious about, you had that slide of barriers, and there's many of them, and everyone wants to collaborate with other institutions, and there's always barriers. What has been the greatest barrier or obstacle that you encountered in assembling these multi-site kind of representative data sets across the UK? Like, what are the biggest, say, 3 obstacles you've encountered?
Capacity in the system to create that new research work. So on top of clinical practice and everything else, and particularly off the back of the pandemic, it's challenging to find the capacity for people to dedicate the time to it, even if they really want to. So resourcing capacity in the system to do that. And that includes not just clinical time, but tech time. So IT to actually physically help with the data pipes and connecting up the infrastructure to enable you to gather and flow the data. Unfortunately, and unsurprising to anybody who's ever done collaborative work with industry, the contractuals. So actually mapping through what are the commercial terms around data sharing, what are the information governance terms around data sharing, who is allowed to access what on what terms, and mapping that through in a way that optimizes the way we use data once, but that you reuse it in a scalable fashion and everybody feels like they've got equity in that system. Took a lot of time to get everybody on board with it, and there was a real push-pull between what industry wanted and what the NHS clinicians wanted out of it, but we managed to get there. So that was tough, but is doable. And then I think those would frankly be the main 2 for us. I think there is not one size fits all for this. Data quality is an issue for AI still, data curation, but I don't think that's a multi-site versus single site problem. I think that's just a problem in terms of we need to code data better and enhance it at source before you use it for research. So people and figuring out how you give everybody enough that they feel like they're growing the pie together rather than fighting over who gets which bit of the pie are the 2 things that I think made a difference in bringing that large number of people together successfully. I'm happy to come visit Canada and help you guys figure it out though. So if you socialized healthcare systems, it's much more like the UK than the American setup. So I think there's a lot of analogies that we've worked similarly.
Absolutely. I think there is last question in relation to the copy of the slides. I think this is being recorded, right?
Yes, we're going to be recording it, and it's going to be available on our website. And I think each participant is going to get an email with a link so they can access the recorded event. Yeah.
Could we ask the ethical question? There was an ethical question here, and I think that's a good one, especially for Claire. And has the UK thought through some of the data justice aspects of this? You know, you and I are white. We are always going to benefit from AI because our health system already prioritizes our care, right? So what is the UK thinking on the data justice front?
So yeah, inclusivity and diversity in terms of data is a critical bit, and the implicit bias around how you do your data collection. So bad data in, bad AI out, and that implicit bias around how you generate your data sets is one that is emerging increasingly. In the UK setting, there is a high and I think an appropriate level of expectation around patient consent and protection around who can access your data and on what terms. The counterbalance to that, though, is that often you end up with smaller data sets that are more homogenous, that aren't reflective of actually the community you want to deploy into. So there's still a big piece of work around engaging the public and patients around wanting to share their data, about the value back into their healthcare system of them doing so, and that by doing that and communicating that well to BAME communities and others, you can get better diverse data in to generate better, more equitable AI out. So there's that component to it. There's also just a piece around how you balance the desire for speed to innovate and access data quickly versus those protections and controls. And it's a tough push-pull, but I think it's one that we shouldn't remove, but you have to find that right balance. And I think some of it is engaging the public in it so that they feel they're part of how you go about making those decisions rather than making it away from them. But that's the UK, and I don't think there's a global solution to that. I think different communities in different parts of the world will have different approaches that suits them. I mean, you see that even nationally to regionally, perspectives vary. There isn't one solution. Technically, there's ways we can do better data sharing around that once you've got the ethics in place. That we can definitely do, but I don't think there's a singular ethical way of bringing patients with you about the use of their data for research. We should all be data donors, though, is my view. Like it's going to benefit us, it'll benefit our kids, it'll benefit future generations. I think we saw that with the pandemic, and it's how do we make people feel like it's still the right thing and valuable for them to be involved.
Jim, I think we covered everything.
We did. There's a lot more to talk about.
Everything,
but,
yes.
It's always the time, right? This is such a fascinating and thought-provoking discussion.
Yes.
I think we need to have a part 2.
Yes, well, we will. As usual, I think we've brought up more questions than we've answered, and what an expert panel you guys are, right? Because that's the perfect thing to do. Leave people with more questions and answers. I think that's AI, and I think that was our intention. So I think we succeeded there. Thank you to everyone for all of our panelists and our guest speakers. Thank you, Claire from UK and Felipe from Brazil. For everyone. We will see you again. I think we're planning something for February 2022, so in the new year. And have a safe evening. Good night.